Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory be forever.
Good morning.
Good morning, Father.
So I'm going to pass something around real quick, and if you can quickly pass it around everybody. I want you to just take a quick look at it and then pass it around. In 1886, a man named Robert Louis Stevenson wrote this interesting piece of literature. That piece of literature was called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the curious case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard who Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was. Well, the whole idea behind Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is that Dr. Jekyll knew that there was something going on and that people had problems within themselves, so he tried to do something to correct it. And he took a serum, he took something that helped him to try to divide that part of him. Well, without knowing, he divided himself. During the day he was Dr. Jekyll, and at night he was Mr. Hyde. Well, at night Mr. Hyde was doing all sorts of evil things. He was beating people up and doing things that Dr. Jekyll wouldn't even dream of doing. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde had this battle. We, who are Christians, should quite well understand this battle. We should quite well understand Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Every one of us, we have this battle raging within us. Every one of us, like Dr. Jekyll, tries as hard as we can to completely eradicate Mr. Hyde. And any of us that have spouses, we have for sure seen our spouse definitely be Dr. Jekyll and most definitely be Mr. Hyde. Right? And if you tell me you haven't seen Mr. Hyde come out, you're going to need to come to confession, because I think you're lying. Okay? So, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll had this struggle, and he knew there was something he needed to do to get rid of that part of him. All right? That's also what we struggle with. We know that there's a part of us that just doesn't belong. I know sometimes, and I've had this conversation, and I've seen my son, right? Vaniyoti, he's in a room and he has my phone, and I just got done telling him, don't touch my phone. And I'll go to the restroom, I'll go to the other room, and he's sitting there, and he's looking behind him, knowing that I could walk in any moment on him. Okay? And I said, son, I said, I see you doing this. I know that you're doing this. You need to really learn how to live like God is watching you, because He is. No matter how many times I try to go before God, and no matter how many times I try to say to Him, Lord, you know my heart, He does. There's a part of me that struggles every day. There's parts of me that I'm trying so hard to root out of my life. I want to be Dr. Jekyll, that good, humane person that wants all the goodness to take care of people. He was a doctor. But oftentimes that Mr. Hyde of me, he comes out. Sometimes my wife says something a little bit off, and Mr. Hyde immediately comes out of me. My son does a little bit of something, Dr. Hyde comes out of me. Dr. Hyde is always there, struggling underneath. There's two people within me that fight constantly within. Today, during the gospel reading, Jesus is faced again with somebody that has these epileptic seizures. The father comes up and says, Lord, please, if you can do anything. And Jesus says, I can do this. I can help you. Remember, I'm paraphrasing. He says, please heal my son. He falls into the fire. He's tormented. And Jesus rebukes the demon. Now, beforehand, this father had brought this boy to the disciples. And the disciples weren't able to cast out the demons. And Jesus says, you weren't able to do it because you have no faith. I'm sure you guys probably, some of you figured out what this is. See this little speck, these little specks here? These are mustard seeds. These right here, these little dots, and this is this little pellet right here is full of them. But this right here are mustard seeds. And Jesus says, if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, the faith of just one of these, you can actually tell a mountain to move, and it will be moved. This is all you have to have, is just this little bit of faith. And Jesus, he just casts out the demon. And then he tells them, you need to, this type of demon actually needs a little bit more. It's prayer and fasting. That's the whole spiritual warfare aspect of our faith. Because there's parts of us that we can't get rid of without having this mustard seed sized faith within us. And there's parts of us that we can't get rid of unless we do a little bit of prayer and fasting. There's some parts of us we have no problem. There's some parts of us that we can just say, I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with lying. I don't have a problem with, this or that. But this other sin, this other thing, this Dr. Hyde part of me, this Mr. Hyde part of me is just within me, and I just can't seem to get rid of it. And that's what we have to do a little bit of prayer and fasting about. And there would be no mountain within us that is too great to move. There's no part of us that is too great for Christ to not be able to come in and fill. We can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. He tells us that. Paul tells us that. But Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that battle that we have within us, it's a raging war at all times. It doesn't matter what day or what point of our lives. It doesn't matter how old we are or how young we are. There's that part of us within us that Mr. Hyde is constantly trying to come out. I was just talking to a friend of mine. I'm sure you know who that friend is. And he was just telling me, he was got a little bit of the struggles that he's going through as he's preparing for this next step in his journey in his life. And the enemy will come, I told him. The enemy will come in all types and all places and all things, and he's going to try to derail you from the things that God has destined for you to do. We talk about these two wills, right? We talk about my will and God's will, and let God's will be done, but oftentimes, because of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we often try to pull this immovable thing called God's will to be in line with ours. We want God's will to be our will. But it's God who wants our will to be His will. And somehow we've got to take this mountain that's built up within us, this part of us that wants to be independent, this part of us that wants to be free from everything that God has taught us. That Mr. Hyde within us that wants to say, I don't want to be in this faith anymore. I don't want to be going down this walk. It's too hard. But somehow, if we just have this much faith, we can tell Mr. Hyde where he can go. We need to drive that guy out, that person out, not to be sexist. Right? Politically correct? But we need to drive that portion of us out that drives us to not want to do the things that we know we should do. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a fascinating read. If you ever get a chance, read through it. I've skimmed through it. I haven't read line by line. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you I've sat down and read line by line, but I have read a good portion of it. And it's an interesting thing that this guy, Stevenson, understands the battle within, the struggle within. And he took it to pen to paper at that time, and he wrote it out. All we need to have is the size of a mustard seed to be able to drive Mr. Hyde away. So today, as we prepare for communion, and today, as we celebrate one of our family getting ready to take that next step into the adventure called life, let us keep in mind what it is that we're struggling with and ask God to give us just a little bit more faith to drive it away. Just a little bit. God does not expect us to go from here to sainthood overnight. It's possible, especially if we have the size of a mustard seed faith. But God usually allows us to take these little tiny baby steps in our growth of faith with Him. So as we prepare today to receive communion, ask God to give you just a little bit more. And if you don't have the size of a mustard seed, ask Him to at least start with this. Because that's how all the great men and women of faith started, with just a little bit of faith, okay? So may the Lord bless us and protect us today. Amen.